First, Doug Campbell-John. Doug is the head of products at LinkedIn Sales Solutions. Prior to that, he was the founder and CEO of FlipTop and the co-founder and CEO of MyPlay and My5 networks. While at Apple, he led product and marketing teams. Second, Peter Hadi is the principal at Moddable. He's also an engineer and entrepreneur focused on client software and has founded several companies. He led QuickTime development at Apple as a distinguished engineer. Last but not least, Bruce Leak is the founder of Playground, a venture fund that helps portfolio companies realize their product and business visions. He's an engineer, entrepreneur, and investor with more than 3 decades of tech industry experience. He invented and brought to market Apple's QuickTime. Please join me in welcoming Doug Campbell-John, Peter Hadi, and Bruce Leak. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
So let's sort of start at the beginning. How did each of you arrive at Apple, and what did you work on there before the QuickTime project?
Oh, I could go first.
Oh, anybody.
So what did I do? I came to Apple straight out of school. I had plotted out a course through college to both get a degree and get a job at Apple, which were 2 parallel activities at the time. I ended up at Apple just through dumb luck in printer testing, which doesn't sound exciting, but printers are graphics, and so I learned a huge amount of graphics. That brought me in touch with, among other teams, the TrueType team. And through some emergency assistance that I provided to them, I met Bruce. And so about 1.5 years after I got to Apple, I got this voicemail from Bruce, who was a legend even then. That was typically short. It was, hey, Peter, this is Bruce Leak. We need to talk. Click. And, a few weeks later, I was on the QuickTime team.
Oh, wow. Bruce?
I came to, somewhat like Peter, I came to to Apple straight out of college. I got my master's at Stanford, and then spent about 6 to 9 months trying to get a job at Apple. I had about 4 interviews during that time, got turned down 3 of them, but finally found a job in system software where I guess the credentials didn't have to be too great to get in. It was really kind of a dream job for me. For me, the Macintosh was the most interesting computer out in the world, and the thing that really made a difference for me I think the biggest innovation was QuickDraw, and the bitmap graphics, and the speed and the performance and the interactivity that it provided. And so my first job was working on color QuickDraw during the shipment of the first Mac II and the Mac SE. And that turned into a product called 32-bit QuickDraw after color QuickDraw became mature, making true color imaging come to the computer. And once you have true color images on the screen, you kind of want them to move and to animate, and video is kind of the natural extension of that. And that was kind of my path into QuickTime.
Doug?
And I, too, came to Apple, first job out of college. I had done 2 summer internships at Apple. Sounds like similar to Bruce's experience. About 4 months after I started at Apple, I got a letter from HR said, sorry, we don't have any jobs for you at Apple, after I'd already started, so there was a little bit of a mismatch there. And I worked on Multimedia, which at the time meant you were plugging a hardware card into an Apple II. And so that's where I started at Apple.
How did you get over to QuickTime?
QuickTime was just, we were in a group that Tyler Peppel was running, and we were all looking at various multimedia projects. So it went from hardware plugged into Apple IIs to hardware plugged into Macintoshes to these crazy guys over at what was called ATG, the Advanced Technology Group, that were doing video in software, although there seemed to be a Freon-cooled computer that was powering it all underneath and behind the curtain.
Oh, the Cray?
Yeah, not a Cray, but like trying to approximate a Cray with Macintoshes. And so that just was some of the coolest stuff that was going on.
Cool. I guess we share this in common. Like my first job out of college was also at Apple. So what kind of digital video or multimedia work had existed in the computer industry prior to QuickTime?
I think Peter's got visual aids.
Oh yeah, and let me hold up the visual aid, and maybe Bruce, you can talk about it.
Yeah.
So this is sort of ridiculous, but I'll just hold that.
That is not a CD-ROM.
Yeah.
That is a Laserdisc. So when we first did multimedia at Apple, it was a computer controlling a Laserdisc player with a television set on the side. The next wave, the radical thing, was you could bring the video and display it within a window on the same screen. But it wasn't digital. It was just pumping analog video in. And so that was kind of the state of multimedia at the time, was computers controlling these external devices.
But there was, I mean, these things were basically analog. These weren't, and you could get maybe a half an hour on a side of one of these.
Yeah.
So they were two-sided, so you flipped it over like a record.
Yep.
Awesome. And go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the video discs were very exciting. There was a variant of the video disc where one revolution was one frame. And so from a computer point of view, you could just put it on a particular track and it would spin and it would be a still of that frame. And then through a serial port, you could have it go to a different point and you could either hit play or pause. But you could use it as a digital frame store, even though it really was just an analog image that was coming out onto an analog display. And multimedia was such a funny thing back then, right? It was kind of like IoT is today. It's it's different things to different people, and there is no such thing as a standard. But someday it'll all work together and it'll all be great. And so this funny, the biggest challenge back then was that video was fundamentally analog, and if you tried to bring it into the digital world, it got really big. Compared to the computers and the memory systems and the bandwidth that was available at the time. And so there were all these weird tricks where, as Doug said, the video would come in and it would show in a window, but it never actually went through the computer. It actually was at the last stage of where the computer was creating video. It would look for like a special color that you'd painted on the screen, and they would replace that with the video as it goes to the monitor. And so the computer didn't actually ever have to deal with all that data flowing through it. And so it was this kind of amazing amount of information that you didn't know how to control. You could just control the spigots, versus actually have time or enough compute to touch the data itself.
But the other interesting thing that was going on sort of outside the computer industry was digital audio was real. So the CD-ROM existed when I was in college, or the audio CD existed when I was in college, which was this, which holds more data than that giant thing on the floor. And the real magic of these was they were super cheap to produce, right? So 650 megabytes of digital data, and it cost even at the time, like $1 to stamp one out once you got to volume. And so people in the computer industry were starting to look at this to what could we do with that? And so, but that came really from consumer electronics, not from computers.
You need to step back and remember that this was a time where there was no internet. And there essentially was no networking outside of maybe your office, and even distributed file servers were pretty rare. Your computer had maybe a 40 megabyte hard drive, which couldn't store a video, might be able to store some images. But how you actually got content was complicated. You'd actually have to go to a store and buy a box that had initially floppy disks in it. And eventually, in this great future world, these CD-ROMs that have these, 600 megabytes of data. But that data was published at some point in time, and so it's stale. It's not like you're going to go watch, the football game that happened last night, or the latest, Game of Thrones video.
And I think a lot of the early things that were happening were around education. So we were doing stuff with like ABC News, for example, who were taking HyperCard, which was this powerful tool for creating these multimedia experiences, and again, controlling a Laserdisc player. But in the classroom, you could suddenly do these things that we're all used to now with DVDs. So you're used to kind of saying, let me jump to a chapter. You didn't do that on VHS tape. So all of a sudden, this was the medium where you could do it by marrying the computer and those Laserdiscs.
Were there any sort of experiments going on within Apple, such as at ATG, with animation, the pencil test video?
Yeah, no, there was a lot of different groups at Apple at this time that were doing a lot of things in the multimedia space. And pencil test, which I guess we have here on the screen, was a big effort out of the ATG Advanced Technology Group, led by Larry Tesler, and the team with Galen Sussman, and this was an amazing project. Kind of in retrospect, I was in system software. This is the time of the color Macintosh and a lot of innovation and a lot of fast-moving hardware was going on, and we were always behind schedule on software. At the time, I was thinking, how does the research team have 20 or 30 people available to work on making an animated video? And how could that be important? And in retrospect, I think pencil test, really gave me exposure and a foundation to, what digital video was all about and what the challenges were of using that on a Macintosh. I mean, this was an amazing thing. This is in 1988 and 89. They used Macintosh 2 computers to create a 3-minute animated video where they did the models. They created the models on the Macintosh. They did the rendering on the Macintosh. And they did all the animation and music and synchronization on a Macintosh. But it also showed just how complicated and how hard this was. I mean, this was an amazing effort that they used to do the rendering. They used, tens, if not, 20s of Macintosh 2 computers to render the frames one at a time because they took minutes to render. Al Caso was running a rendering farm. I think they calculated it would take a month or 2 to render it on one computer. And they couldn't even, on some of these computers, since they only had 2 megabytes of memory, they couldn't render an entire frame. So they had to render pieces of a frame at a time and then reassemble them onto a file server. But as I mentioned before, the Macintosh back then had maybe a 40 or 80 megabyte hard drive. The pencil test video had more than 5,000 frames, each one a megabyte each. So you've got 5 gigabytes of information that there's no place to keep. And the funniest thing was that in order to output this, they had to load it 100 frames at a time on a digital video storage machine that cost more than $100,000. And those 100 frames, which is about 3 seconds, they would then output to videotape. And they'd had to do that. They had to do that 50 times in order to get the 3-minute video. And who in a normal computer would be able to do this thing?
And so, I mean, that was before my time, and I watched these videos countless times as we did QuickTime development because they were some of the test footage we used. And the thing that I remember from watching the making of video, which you can find on YouTube today, is that the intention behind all of this was to understand what it was like to make animation on a Macintosh, right? It wasn't, they wanted the result to be interesting, but they really wanted to learn, like, what are the challenges in building stuff on a Mac, and what do we need in the future so that instead of hundreds of thousands of dollars of gear, like, normal people can do this at home. And that idea very much influenced the work that we ended up doing on QuickTime, which was very much about democratizing, getting this technology into everyone's hands.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there were certainly other experiments. You can talk about the hardware accelerators and hardware windows.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly had a lot of stuff that we were, again, the ATG group was rolling out these notions. I remember one, there was a company called Macromind that was doing kind of this kind of multimedia, kind of advanced HyperCard kind of composition experience. And we were able to use enough of frames where we put together a video where we had kind of mocked up what it looked like to do cut and paste video into, I think, Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, and showed it to the Microsoft Office guys and totally flipped them out because they couldn't figure out what version of Microsoft Office we were using to do this. But it was all smoke and mirrors, all totally fake. But it was really about between these pieces, you were suddenly starting to see that there were, the pieces could come together where suddenly it went from this analog video that was glommed onto the side, within a video, suddenly making it digital, to the breakthrough was really thinking about video as just another data type that you could cut and paste, just like text and graphics.
So could you explain to the audience exactly what is QuickTime? People think of it as just a player application, but it's more than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, QuickTime is really just, it is a enabling software platform for multimedia. And I think the brilliance of what these guys did in kind of laying it out was that it was, again, you get a sense of how limited the environments were at the time and how tough it was to kind of even get some basic stuff going. But they built this in a way in under a year, basically for the first version, where not only were we able to ship it independently from the main software release, they built an architecture that scaled as there were all kinds of different hardware platforms, different video compression schemes, different audio formats. It kind of took all that into consideration. And then I think the final layer was that although a lot of this stuff was down in the weeds and some developers wanted to play at that level, they kind of added these layers on top so that if somebody like Microsoft wanted to just do cut and paste video, it's very simple from a developer to go incorporate that into your apps.
How did the QuickTime project start? We saw that pencil test came out of ATG, but was it directly out of ATG, or what was?
There were many components that came out of ATG, out of the research teams, and there were many drivers for the creation of QuickTime. I think the funny kind of enigma of the founding of QuickTime was that it was actually announced at the Worldwide Developers Conference in 1990, and none of the people on this panel were there. In fact, no one I knew was there. It was announced as QuickTime TM is this new multimedia architecture that we're looking for contributions from our developers to help us get done by the end of the year. And it's going to be great, and it's going to be cross-platform, and it's going to be everything multimedia should be, including the ability to control disparate devices like fax machines. And we never actually got the fax machine to be part of it. But it was a fabulous name, and it was a great time where multimedia should be standardized and cross-platform. And there were a lot of, after that was announced at the Worldwide Developers Conference, there were a lot of people looking around inside Apple of like, who's doing that? That sounds really good. And a few people raised their hands. And eventually, it was a coordinated effort of people from kind of on loan from the research teams, as well as from system software. And I had come to a point with 32-bit color QuickDraw where that was fairly mature, and this was kind of the next kind of extension of system software that made sense. And we got the charter to kind of own it and run it. And since we'd created a way to ship software to developers with 32-bit QuickDraw, we could just keep using that channel. Distribution channels were not very common back then. You either got shipped as part of a new hardware release, or you got shipped as part of a huge system software release that was across all platforms, which kept getting longer and longer, those cycles. And we had the privilege of being able to ship kind of on our own schedule and meet the needs of the developer community, and had all the support internally to be able to do that. But we should definitely talk about some of the contributions from the research teams from ATG. Compression was a big deal that was going to make this happen, right? If you think back about pencil test, having 5 gigabytes of data for a 3-minute video just is unwieldy, and you need to be able to compress that into something rational, even to get it onto one CD-ROM of 600 megabytes. And fortunately, there was a lot of work going on in the research teams, some on hardware compression, some on software compression. Eric Hoffert had been doing some work there. Lee Migdal, who I believe is in the audience, turned that into reality and actually joined the QuickTime team to see it through. We also had people from John Worthington and people from the MIDI side of the advanced research team that joined the QuickTime team. We had people from HyperCard, Ken Doyle, HyperCard was kind of the interactive, the internet, the interactive web, but before the web. The way people could author content that was interactive. And Ken created the interface for all the HyperCard developers to have access to the capabilities of QuickTime.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting, sorry. I think it's worth noting that we got good air cover. So we had folks like Dave Nagel in the head of our R&D. We had Roger Heinen from software, who basically let us build this little pirate band. We got space over in one building. I think we flew a pirate flag at one point, like the Mac team, and kind of said, yeah, you go play with that stuff, and we'll kind of give you resources to go explore that. So that's also a big part of why we were able to do what we did.
You know, and the other thing that I think was really interesting was this combination of the work that Bruce and some other folks had done on the graphics team, kind of picking up some of the technology that came out of the advanced technology group, because I know like Sean Callahan, Mark Kruger, and Lee Migdal all spent huge amounts of time refining and especially optimizing the compressors and decompressors that were in QuickTime. And that skill, being able to get code to run that fast on those machines, was rare. It's still rare. And without that level of attention to detail where every cycle counted, and Sean Callahan used to keep the cycle counter for the 68K for all the instructions on the side of his monitor. Without that attention to detail, QuickTime would have been interesting, but it wouldn't have performed well enough that anybody would have used it.
Yeah, speaking of performance, what were some of the technical challenges in getting video to work, especially with accurate time?
I mean, the one, so we talked a little bit about video. The other one that I desperately remember is CD-ROM. Like, that was the way we had to deliver content. And you don't think of a CD-ROM as slow, but it's crazy slow if you have to seek, right? And so we had to do a huge amount of work to schedule how we read from the CD-ROM. A guy named George Cossey did all the early work on this. It was a small miracle, just so that we would never seek, because anytime you wanted to jump on the CD, it was like a second. And everything in your computer would just stop. We couldn't draw any more video. The sound might go for a while longer, but that was it. And so the CD-ROM, we worked to make invisible, but that was by constant profiling and tweaking and adjusting, and it was a huge project.
We also, on the time front, one of the things that QuickTime, it's funny how many different subsystems were necessary in order to make QuickTime successful. And we knew about all of them because we were shipping a package that had to work on any different Macintosh. And so fortunately, coming out of system software, we knew all the different groups and all the capabilities, and we could borrow, steal capabilities that were necessary to make our developers successful. And so one of them was we had our own time manager, which was written by Gary Davidian, who I see in the audience, which created a new ability to ask for a microsecond resolution clock timer, and so that you could do accurate positioning of sound and video. And just that capability, having that available on whatever computer we were on, and we just carried that with us. And eventually it was in System 7 and other future system software versions. But that was very important. One thing I realized, working on QuickTime was how important exact the math and time of video was. And so, for example, most people think that video is 30 frames a second or 60 fields a second, but it's actually 59.97 fields a second. And that difference of 59.97 versus 60, as you go across thousands, if not tens of thousands of frames, starts to mean seconds of error in a fairly short clip. And so if you're not super accurate in the math that you use in order to calculate indexing into a video, the audio and video wouldn't be in sync. And we kind of got shocked by that fairly early on in the process. Like, why isn't this ever in sync? If you're only doing a short video, you never notice it. But once you get a 30-minute video, it's like, wow, the timing is way off. And so we had to calculate, we had to actually create a data type for calculating the frame rate and using things like the microsecond timer that Gary Davidian did. We also had special file system capabilities. We had the alias manager built into QuickTime so that we can, when you copy and paste, you don't actually want to move all that data in and out like you would text. You just want to move references to it. And so the alias manager gave us that capability that we could have data for the movie separate from the movie file itself. And we had several other capabilities like that.
We brought back a bunch of the System 7 functionality, like the file system we brought back to system, new file system calls we brought back to System 6. But I mean, we were just hell-bent on getting it to work, so we just, we found everybody we could possibly find to help us. The one funny thing I remember, so Gary Davidian is a phenomenal performance engineer, and we should all dream to be half as good as he is someday. He did the microseconds timer, which changed the resolution of Macintosh by orders of magnitude. In an uncharacteristic move, there was a bug in Gary's code. And it took us months to figure it out, but every once in a while, microseconds would return a time before the last time it returned. So time would momentarily run backwards and then resume. took forever to just even know that that was what was going on. And of course, it got fixed to the benefit of everybody. But there were, I mean, we were, you know, when you're writing software and you can't rely on time being correct, you're really in like another place in terms of the level of challenge that you're fighting with.
I think the other thing that was challenging, and I think a huge benefit of QuickTime was the work that was done on the sound manager as part of QuickTime. Kip Olson and his team and Jim Reeks joined the sound, basically the sound manager team joined QuickTime as part of the core team. And we basically started to think about audio more the way we thought about graphics, where you'd want, you know, prior to QuickTime, you know, audio was a big part of Macintosh, but audio formats were basically whatever the hardware supported. Where, you know, QuickDraw was all about being able to interchange, different graphics formats, and everything will work independent of what hardware you are. So you have this abstraction layer. And then we basically did the same thing with sound, where you could have multiple channels of sound that could mix together, that could be different sample rates, could be different sample sizes, and the developer didn't care. It didn't matter what the hardware would support, we would just mix it all down and make it work. And by being able to do that meant that you were able to speed up and slow down movies, and you were able to synchronize them because you didn't care what the audio rates were. You would make them, you know, you would convert them to the right answer for what you needed.
Could we move on to talking a bit about, you mentioned earlier compression. So the Apple video compression codec was codenamed Road Pizza?
So that name came out of advanced research, so I can't claim credit for that.
Yeah, the idea is when you run over an animal, you're basically compressing it on the freeway. So that's where road pizza
But it
came
doesn't
from,
look
yeah.
quite the same, but it's representative of the original.
Yes, that was the nickname for it. It's a form of compression.
Right. So do we have an early video that shows the use of this codec?
Yeah. So it's Jim Batson, Doug, Bruce, and
Sean
Mark
Cameron.
Kruger.
David Van Brink.
And David Van Brink. Yeah.
More productive engineering time. Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, one of the really interesting, Doug, you know,
Saying
hamming it up for the camera. One of the interesting characteristics of Road Pizza for the time is that it was reasonably symmetric. So Bruce talked about how much time it took to make one frame of Pencil Test. And compressing video at this time, for the most part, was an offline thing. It would take, you know, several seconds to several minutes to compress one frame. And one of the really interesting characteristics of Road Pizza, which became the Apple video codec, was that it was more or less symmetric. I mean, mostly because Lee worked really hard to get it that way. But which meant that you could record to Apple Video in real time, or you could capture something raw and then recompress it in very close to real time. And that made it possible to author video just on a whim, versus it being a big production and a big costly thing. And that changed, I mean, when you look at like the QuickTime Alpha CD, there's tons of movies like this because we were just playing. Like all of a sudden everybody could do this and everybody wanted to try. And so that relatively close to symmetric compression to decompression performance was a really big deal.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think the fact that you could record live video, maybe not at full frame rate, but at a smaller size and at maybe 15 frames a second or 10 frames a second, you can just record that to your disk. Was a game changer, because before that, if you had to record it uncompressed, one, you wouldn't have enough space or enough bandwidth on the bus, so it just wasn't possible. Now, once you can compress it and then record it, now you can do this kind of continuously, right? So you could do a 30-minute video, which was unheard of, right? Versus you'd have to capture it all in RAM, where maybe you could do 10 seconds. And you'd compress it and then put it out to disk.
I think it's important to also remember that, and this was after QuickTime launched, is it was still hard to get video into the Macintosh. So I think credit is due also to SuperMac, who came out with the first low-end card, weirdly named Video Spigot, to pour video into the Macintosh. And but it was the first time you could have an affordable way to do it, not spend thousands of dollars to suddenly get video into a QuickTime format.
Yeah. So prior to QuickTime's launch in 1991, the technology was publicly demonstrated at a 1990 education conference called EDUCOM. So the museum recently filmed a restoration of this demo called News Navigator. Let's take a look.
Welcome to News Navigator, interactive information delivery technology.
My name is Greg Gretsch. I worked at Apple from 1988 to 1992. In 1990, I was the executive producer of the News Navigator.
So on Sunday morning in October the 14th in 1990, this is the first thing that the conference attendees saw. I'm Clayton Sanders, and in 1990 I was in charge of interactive video and special projects and things like that at the University of Georgia. So when you clicked here, you went to a menu of the video stories that were available. And again, we're throwing up this color on top of HyperCard. So here would be the stories of this thing. There were sports stories.
Montana passed for a career-high 476 yards and 6 touchdowns.
We actually had a weather report every day. We also did a guide to Atlanta. We did have a story on the last day about how we did the News Navigator. Well, even in those days, there were Easter eggs where things were hidden, and so the guys got a little wild on the last day. And so if you knew to hold the option key down, for instance, my name changed to Dad. If you held Dean Blackketter, if you held the option key for Dean Blackketter.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
This is Greg in the background.
Eat the Whopper with cheese. Have a jumbo Snicker.
QuickTime didn't exist at that point as a product by Apple. In fact, QuickTime wasn't released until a year after we first showed it at EduCom in Atlanta in 1990. So this was the first ever public display of digital video on a computer.
We didn't want to just show movies on the screen. We wanted to show this is what this technology is going to be good for. We really wanted to show this is a real world use for video.
So Greg says this was the first public demo of QuickTime. There seems to be some disagreement on which was the actual first public demo of QuickTime.
You know, it all depends on what you think QuickTime is. I mean, this was definitely the QuickTime code, you know, through the HyperCard interface that Ken Doyle worked on. And so we're definitely proud of what Greg created there. As I said earlier, there was the 1990 Worldwide Developers Conference where someone named Don Casey, who no one has ever met, announced QuickTime. But he also showed some digital video on the Macintosh, which we presume came from the advanced research team and some of the special projects groups there. And so, you know, I think everything's true.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about, I mean, you're listed in the credits of that thing.
Well, it's because, I mean, that was an early version of QuickTime, right? So that had the QuickTime core technology in it, and then it had the HyperCard interface that was released with QuickTime. And this was just a pre-release version of that they used for the conference. And HyperCard was the multimedia authoring tool of choice. And was how a lot of QuickTime content was created. And so it was an important part of the QuickTime project.
For just Apple history note, in doing some research into this, I found that 2 or 3 years before that, a very famous Apple video, the Knowledge Navigator, was premiered at the same conference. And so this was clearly at the time sort of a place where Apple took new ideas out to put them in front of educators and get them into the air.
Right, and I think, you know, that thing is called News Navigator. It's clearly designed to reference back to the Knowledge Navigator. Yeah. Let's move on to sort of the launch. So a week before the public announcement, you guys made a QuickTime 1.0 alpha movie test. So let's take a look at this video.
They talk about the information management industry, but they have a different nomenclature. I believe that it is.
You're demoing for the same client? Mm-hmm. I didn't know we were competing for the contract.
Yeah, I guess so.
So, this your program?
Yeah.
Boy, it sure makes mine look pathetic.
Thanks.
I guess your multimedia consultant helped you out, huh?
Nah, I did it all myself with this new multimedia toolkit.
You did this digital video with synchronous sound coming from a CD in a window?
Yeah, 1 page of code.
And this video real-time capture? 1 page. Hey, look what Zach did for the client.
This human interface, it's the best I've ever seen. What else can your program do?
The inner workings of the Spud missile. Wow.
Used to say Scud. I changed it.
You did that to a movie?
Uh-huh. Oh, here's the client. Gotta go. You know, my company got me a multimedia toolkit. I can't do that.
Me neither.
Maybe I'm just stupid.
Nah, we're not stupid. Our company's got us crummy tools.
We got crummy companies.
So, yeah.
So what's going on there?
There's a lot going on there.
So that was Jim Batson and
Who's right here, thank you.
and 2 others of us on there. Hey, Jim. Great acting. Peter, you want to talk about it?
Sorry. So first, we shouldn't take too much credit for the script. This was a parody of a Saturday Night Live commercial, which was probably a parody of another, of a real commercial. And we must have videotaped it and did this. And we shot this like on a Sunday, literally like the day or 2 before the WWDC when we launched QuickTime. And if I remember right, Paul Mercer was on camera. He came in and helped us. Just another random note. But we scripted it, we shot it, we acted, sort of. And then the fun began because we talked about, well, QuickTime can digitize video, it can capture it in real time, it can edit it, you could put titles. And that was all sort of true, but this was like alpha. And somehow I was the one responsible for editing this together and capturing it. And it's the night before the conference, and so I'm there. I've been on the team for 3 months at the time, and just happy to be at Apple at all. And I'm sitting there really digitizing, and things would crash, and Bruce and Jim and everybody would be standing over my shoulder. So how's it going? And I'm literally debugging the code as it goes, and we got it. I mean, it worked. It wasn't beautiful, but it got a laugh, which was the point. But we walked away with this long list of, wow, we got a lot to do. This was terrible. This was terrible. This is terrible. This is buggy. This is terrible. And it's like I view it like pencil test. Pencil test is art. This is silly, but like pencil test in that we were using our technology. We cared about the result. It wasn't just can we capture video and watch it. We wanted it to be interesting. We wanted it to look a certain way. And so we jumped through the hoops as best we could in 24 hours to get there. And so this started a thing with the QuickTime team where we did these for WWDC for years. And they got increasingly bizarre. But it was always a great adventure to kind of use our technology ourselves.
There's nothing like dogfooding to make sure that the products really work. And I mean, that was one reason why the HyperCard team was great to have them, because they were built-in customers who were trying to do real things. And they're our customers. So they sit right around the corner from us.
Yeah, we also had Duncan Kennedy led the evangelism efforts, a term I think Apple coined. And so we also had a handful of developers we had brought in behind the velvet rope at that time who were banging on the code and helped us with demonstrations when we launched it at the conference.
I mean, there was another example I was working with some Apple friends, Steve Perlman, who actually is one of the fathers of QuickTime from the research side, doing hardware accelerators and showing hardware video in Windows and really motivating the vision of what was possible, things that we wanted to be able to achieve in software and give to every computer. But spent some long evenings with him and some other friends making claymations. And then when you want to edit those, it's frame by frame, and you're trying to, you made a mistake and you want to remove a frame, and it's really detailed editing work. It put a lot of pressure on the tools we had in house, where you've got a movie where almost every frame has been edited in or out a few times, very complicated edit lists, and we found quite a number of bugs. You're off by one frame on editing a normal movie. It doesn't really matter very much, but if every frame in there is one frame, off by one frame kind of makes a big difference.
That's the thing you have to remember. I mean, the kind of the pioneers of digital video editing and digital audio editing, DigiDesign and Avid were 2 of those companies. were writing directly to hardware. They're doing every trick in the book. There's no way that kind of mass market video and audio editing tools would have come to be accessible to all of us if it weren't for QuickTime.
So QuickTime was built as a technology for developers. Could you share how third-party software developers impacted its development?
How third-party software development?
Oh, how did third-party software developers impact the development of QuickTime?
Oh, they were huge. I mean, like, QuickTime again was really about how to, we were just this extension that was being distributed. You could do some stuff on your own, but ultimately it was about all the applications that were going to wrap around that. And I think the power, again, was making it easy for these developers to incorporate this stuff without having to know a lot of the intricacies of this audio-video synchronization stuff.
No, and I mean, one of the key points about QuickTime was not just video, but human interface standards for how video would integrate into the macOS experience. And we had really interesting designs, good work from Mike Mills and ATG and from the Apple HI team. And there was no implementation. And so, poor Doug and Duncan would go and show it to developers and say, okay, put this in your app. And they're like, that's great. How are we going to do that? Yeah. That looks like a lot of work. And so it ended up coming back to me, and the movie controller, we called the standard movie controller at the time, which that little bar you saw at the bottom of all the videos, came out of that. And the goal was just to package everything up so that anybody could drop video into an app. And in the briefing room, the silly video you just saw, you saw Jim and I Bruce pass 1 page of code. That was literally the code that you had to put into your application to get it to play back video, and with a standard Apple-blessed user interface. And so we were not only out there telling developers what we wanted them to do in their products, but listening to their feedback and modifying our product to make those things easy for them so that they wouldn't have any reason not to.
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting you mentioned the user interface stuff. We just take for granted that you can take this slider and move it back and forth. If you looked at every other multimedia interface at that time, it was mimicking the buttons on a VHS player. So it was fast forward, play, and that's how you would move back and forth. This notion of suddenly grabbing this slider was a breakthrough.
So earlier you guys talked about the distribution of QuickTime. So this was somewhat unusual for Apple at the time, right? So one thing is you had the QuickTime starter kit that was sold in stores in a retail box, but you also gave away the QuickTime extension for free for download on bulletin board services. So what was the motivation behind this distribution strategy?
Well, I'll talk about the QuickTime starter kit. We were just kind of making shit up as we went along. Yeah. Pretty much. No, I mean, like, the idea was, how do you get stuff out? How do you take something that is a underlying system software extension and make it useful to lots of people? So we worked with a design firm who had contracted a bunch of videos that you could use as kind of clip video art. It was kind of a new concept. Put some tools together and just kind of figured out, hey, let's go put a package. And it was the first time that Apple had actually done retail software for the Macintosh. So we had to bring these experts in, like, how do you sell a box of software at Fry's, and how does this all go? So it's a really fun journey, but I think that was just, we were looking for all these different ways to take this thing that we invented and make it more accessible to the masses.
And a big part of that, though, is our developers. In fact, because we were not built into macOS, we were shipped with it. Yeah. But it wasn't in the default install because it was still like a little bit of a heavy lift for those computers. And so we relied on our developers to use it, to create demand for it, but also to include it in their product boxes. And there was an interesting marketing piece that came out of that, which is we licensed it to them for free, so they could just stick it in the box. But they had to put the QuickTime logo on the packaging. So we had QuickTime logos in computer stores everywhere, which was spectacular. And then, of course, what happened is how do we say it delicately? The adult film industry discovered digital video. And the license, so we're like, oh yeah, I mean, free speech, okay, they can distribute it too. But the license changed from saying you must put the QuickTime logo on the box to saying either you must or you absolutely cannot, at Apple's discretion. But so, I mean, the developers were really a part of how we got this onto people's computers and creating the demand to use the technology. It wasn't something we could do alone.
And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to make it work with System 6, because System 7 had just been launched and announced, but we wanted to make sure that developers were still writing applications for all the computers that were out there, We wanted to make sure QuickTime was available everywhere so that they could rely on it and not have to, do something else when it wasn't there, and then it'll limit the number of people who use multimedia in their applications.
Right. Yeah. So after QuickTime 1.0 launched, what were some of the directions that you wanted to take for 2.0? We have an example of an experiment that you did after the launch.
Let's see it.
So the thing that happened after this is, sadly far too typical. The thing that happened after 1.0 is we got some sleep. And there was an early slide from Bruce that said of QuickTime 1.0, sleep is optional. And so we finally got some rest, and we had a chance to play with this stuff. And Sean Callahan did rotated video, and David Van Brink did strange MIDI music triggered things. And there was, Peter Barrett at Supermax started doing what became Cinepack. There was just all these things. And I became obsessed with blue screen. And so this was me in my office late one night doing a live blue screen. So I literally held it, I hung a piece of fabric in my office, and the video was being recorded, and because Road Pizza was fast enough, I could capture this live and composite it. And the reason I'm rolling in is I had to press play on my computer to get it going, roll into the scene, do this fabulous acting job, and then roll back to turn it off. And so, these were just, it's one of my favorite stupid clips ever, but it's so typical of the kind of playing that we were doing and people at universities were doing and people at software developers were doing, just to find the limits of what was possible. And then the next version sort of pulled, the experiments out of that seemed most practical.
And as always there, we had, help from the ATG team thinking about what could be next. Things like, QuickTime VR, QuickTime video conferencing, 3D object, tracks.
Yeah. How did QuickTime grow into that set of related projects? Because, QuickTime became a sort of multiple teams, correct? Like VR, conferencing.
It was, these guys left. They did their parts. I will answer that question. Sorry. But there's people like Eric Hoffert. In fact, people in ATG who were contributing to this, and then kind of just kept going. And we were, through the amazing structure and freedom that Doug and Bruce had set up for us, where we were kind of off to the side. We were often a cross-functional team with people from different parts of the company in it. There was just room for everybody to kind of explore these things. And so QuickTime VR came out of work that was really clever in ATG about image decompression and warping. Eric Hoffert, Dean Blackheader, and friends pushed the conferencing side through. And it was just this natural hub that was importantly decoupled from system software, so people could play. And
I think what, part of what happened was some of the research groups saw that, hey, you can take some of your cool stuff and actually get it out to customers, and that's kind of fun. Let's keep doing that. And so it started to blossom in that way.
Yeah, and sometimes you had to use different tactics. So one of the things we realized is that John Scully, the CEO at the time, loved to announce stuff way before it was ready. And so we decided we wanted to do QuickTime for Windows. So we basically hired a little contractor team in San Francisco to develop a Windows version of QuickTime, showed it to John. He got really excited, showed it off in a public setting, and all of a sudden we were on the hook to go deliver our first Windows product. And so,
that's I want to talk more about QuickTime for Windows, because that's this is Apple putting out a Windows product, right? This is not something that Apple typically did. And so, first, I guess how hard was it to convince the company to do that? And, talk a bit more about how do you do the porting to Windows, and how important was this actually for establishing QuickTime as a platform?
Yeah, the way we did it was, basically subterfuge. So that was the strategy. And I think that once it was out there, we obviously needed to bring that in-house, and you guys can.
Well, Jim Batson ran the QuickTime for Windows effort, kind of from the beginning, even managing the outside consultants. But we realized early on that this had to be a cross-platform solution. and Windows was much further behind. And by putting out something that at least could play back QuickTime videos, maybe you author them on the Macintosh, but at least being able to have a broader audience. I mean, we were looking at education, we were looking at computer-based training, and there were unfortunately a large number of Windows computers out there at the time. So we thought, hey, let's just co-opt them. And to some degree, the fact that we shipped QuickTime separate from the system software on Macintosh, even though we were very familiar with it, kind of gave us the guts to go do it on Windows. Like, hey, if we can do it on top of Macintosh, we can just do it on top of Windows. I mean, we're standalone enough where we know we have the pieces we need, and we'll just do whatever it takes.
And I mean, a huge amount of credit goes to Jim for making that work. I remember none of us on the QuickTime team were super excited about our stuff going to Windows. It's hard to understate how much that was seen as pure evil over there. I mean, and these outside contractors.
Not necessarily evil, but also just hard and different. Right? I mean, we knew the inner bowels of Macintosh, inside out. Windows was a whole new set of problems.
And I remember one late night, Jim and I were talking about this in a not entirely positive way. And at some point we sort of realized, oh, this reflects on us. It's got our name on it. It's going to be called QuickTime on Windows, and if it's terrible, we're going to look terrible. And so we sort of at that, I remember that moment, and we were just like, okay, so we have to work with these contractors to make this great. And so we did, and Jim ran that, for some years. And then a terrible thing happened, which actually Doug had predicted in the announcement I was watching us talking about. He said, QuickTime for Windows will probably be a little bit behind QuickTime for Mac, and maybe not have all the features. And then he paused and he said, and it'll probably stay that way. Because there's always porting, and of course he was right, but we grew to hate that because we would put new features into QuickTime for Mac, and we would innovate like crazy and do crazy blue screen or whatever, and then developers would say, so, when's that going to be on Windows? That's when we'll use it. And that developer feedback, again, really led us to combine the code bases. And so we ported, like we did back to System 6, we ported huge chunks of Mac OS to Windows to make QuickTime for Windows and Mac ship in lockstep. And we did that for years. We ported Bruce's QuickDraw work. We ported all kinds of stuff. And another story for another time, but that had a huge impact later on Apple's transition to OS X because they needed the Carbon emulation layer, which was built on that experience and maybe a little of that code too. Jim will tell that story someday.
Yeah, that's a good segue to my next question, which is how did the return of Steve Jobs, because QuickTime was developed during the Scully period, and arguably, would you agree that QuickTime is probably the most consequential technology developed by Apple during the time that Steve wasn't there?
We would say so.
It certainly took our attention.
But could you speak to how the return of Steve and the transition to Mac OS X affected the development of QuickTime?
Well, the first thing is it was, a small miracle or good fortune that it continued. When Steve came back and everything was sort of challenging at Apple, the Next OS came in, and Next had something very cleverly titled Next Time, which was their QuickTime ripoff. And when I met Peter Graffignino, who ran graphics at Apple for years after that, one of the very first conversations, he's like, your stuff looks much better than ours. Maybe you could keep doing that, and we could forget about this Next Time thing. And at that, in the first couple months of Jobs being interim CEO, all the teams got hauled in for meetings. And the stories of this have been famously told. I won't repeat it. But one thing that came out, I remember being there and gasping for air. But one of the ideas that Steve had in his head, even way back when, was that one of the next big things was going to be video. And so DVD authoring came out of that, iMovie came out of that, and so QuickTime, which was doing pretty well at the time, was seen as a vehicle to enable that. And so, Steve, I would say, transitioned the focus of QuickTime a little bit away from third-party developers and more to internal developers, but gave us, fantastic resources, fantastic support, let us live. And I think that was all great.
Could you talk a little bit about how QuickTime became part of the MPEG-4 video standard, and how important was that to both Apple and the industry?
So, Doug, I want to ask you to start by all the early QuickTime slides, going way back, even to the Don Casey ones, talked about a cross-platform file format.
I'm sure it was just marketing. I was making stuff up. Yeah.
No, there you go.
But I mean, the idea again that was part of QuickTime was this system that was not going to be locked in one point in time. So it went from Road Pizza, Peter Barrett. We actually licensed a codec, compression scheme from Supermac called Cinepack that kind of took things up a level. But the idea was, how do we make this mainstream? And part of the way you make something mainstream is to get it into standard formats like MPEG-4.
Yeah, and so we had, very early on, like when QuickTime 1.0 shipped, we shipped code to make QuickTime movies on Unix boxes, so that workstations could create QuickTime code. So the idea of an open public file format was there from the start. What happened, Dave Singer was involved in standards work at Apple for years and was part of the QuickTime team working on streaming. And when Steve came back, we were not winning with QuickTime in the streaming front. We were very focused on authoring and interactivity and doing fine, but the world was moving to streaming and we were a little late to that game. And one of the ways that Steve thought to catch up was we could make QuickTime a standard because people will grab onto those. And so we had been talking with MPEG-4. It wasn't a completely new thing, but at some point it came to his attention. He's like, okay, so you're going to go make that a standard. And Dave Singer and I kind of, yeah, okay, great, we'll try. And he's like, no, we will succeed. We're like, okay, we'll get back to you. He's like, no, so this is what you're going to do. Okay, great, listening. He says, you're going to go find something that the MPEG committee accepted. You're going to go find an A+ proposal. I remember those words. And you are going to study that, and you are going to do whatever they did. We said, okay, we'll do that. And he said, great. I need a draft in a week. And I don't know if it was exactly a week, but it was like that. And so Dave Singer and I'm sure with help from other people on the team, did something. We sent it to Steve, and we had a conference call with Steve, who was on vacation in Maui, who was giving us notes on our proposal to the MPEG committee. And so we did that. And the other brilliant thing he did, though, as part of that, he really understood a lot about how the world works, was he said, this shouldn't just be Apple, it's an open standard. And so he recruited people from Oracle, of course, natural one, from IBM, my enemy is our mutual enemy, we can be friends, and a couple other companies to go and promote this together. So it wasn't just Apple doing that. And it was a long project, and we almost lost a bunch of times. But the staying power is spectacular. Like every device today plays MPEG-4 files. And the other interesting thing is Dave Singer, who celebrated his 30th anniversary with Apple a couple weeks ago, is now leading the MPEG committee responsible for file formats, and has been almost since we did that work. And so, Jobs was right. You do the standard, you get in the right place, and you have an influence and a seat at the table for guiding that stuff forever. And so, it was a really impressive piece. But what MPEG standardized was the file format that Jim and a few other people created back in 1990, 1991. The ideas for flexibility that were built into it really carried it through.
Could you guys talk about QuickTime's impact on professional film, video, and music production?
Yeah, as I said, we had, I remember actually finding Avid, which was one of the leaders of digital video and the pioneers. And I think they were running they were on some Unix box, like an Apollo box. We found them at a SIGGRAPH booth somewhere in the corner. And Tyler Peppel, who was running the Multimedia group, and Albert Chu and a few others, basically shanghaied, the founder of Avid, and convinced him, you should do this on the Mac. And he looked at us like we're crazy, like Macs are these weak little things. I need this big, powerful Unix box. But we worked closely with some of those early developers to make those things happen on the Mac first, so that Mac could not only be a desktop publishing platform, but a digital video and a digital audio creation platform, and move that away from the workstation market. And then it was really working with a number of companies that were doing things like Adobe Premiere, or what was first, Supermac and other folks in that space, to really create these and democratize these tools. I mean, the really satisfying thing for me right now is that the fact that you can take out your iPhone, you can go compose a song, you can record a video, you can edit a video, and the seeds for all that were planted, 25 plus years ago.
And how has QuickTime affected consumer electronics?
We still don't control fax machines. That's a deep disappointment amongst this team. Although we did have a colleague of mine, Michael Chow, who had a fantastic sense of humor, once set up a bread making machine on the local area network at Apple and had a custom label called Bread Writer, written to it at an Ethernet port and connected to it. So we pretended like we could print bread remotely. I think the consumer electronics, again, the thing that's interesting about this is this was radical at the time. Now it's like water, it's like electricity. Like you turn on your iPad, you turn on your iPhone, think twice about like doing stuff with video and audio and editing a clip down and then pasting it to a social media site. So that's the satisfying part, that it's just kind of in the background.
Mm-hmm. And Bruce observed that when Apple went live with the iTunes Store selling songs, what were they selling? They were selling QuickTime files. It was encrypted MPEG-4 audio files, right? And it's not a mistake. And like the iPod, Apple had so much music DNA in the company from in part the work that we did and the things we put in place, that was a natural thing. And so, I always say like the work we did great work. We're proud of it. Like it had some impact. We were fortunate to have that opportunity. Digital video, it would have happened. That was there, but it has a character. It has some impact of that. And the stuff Doug talked about, I think, is really important. That the idea that it was not, professionals creating and everybody else consuming. That anybody who wanted to make something should be able to do that. And that's why Randy spent time doing iMovie for iPhone, for example, and solving those problems again. Same guy who did Adobe Premiere back in 1991. And so those ideas, and in a lot of cases, those people have continued to have an impact in moving that stuff forward.
Could you summarize QuickTime's legacy for Apple, for Silicon Valley, and for Hollywood?
Bruce, you can take that question.
I think it's what Peter said. Digital video would have happened no matter what. We were at the right place at the right time, and we had the opportunity to make it a broader, more interesting standard, and have some, an interchange format that had some staying power. Any software that is still, meaningful 25, 30 years later is kind of shocking. So, we did something right from a flexibility and from a future-proofing point of view. And I think that, that certainly reflects well on Apple. And it's the right place to do it. Just like Doug said, they were clearly the desktop publishing solution, and turning that into the multimedia solution for both authoring and playback just made perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. I think the standard part of it is it's easy to overlook and hard to understate. There's things that have happened that we never would have predicted. I always look at podcasting, which came on MP3, which wasn't us, but the video podcasting. When you're podcasting, you need a standard format to put your content in so that everybody can play the file. And the only thing that worked for that, and still works for that, is MP4 video files, which are, again, QuickTime files. And so that idea of a standard thing that works everywhere, that it succeeded, enabled some of these other things to happen independently of us. And I think that, again, also because we did the player for Windows for years and years, so that standard format could work and evolve. And so, Doug and Bruce are absolutely right. Like it's water now. It's easy. My kids play with digital video all the time and don't think twice about it. And that's the way it should be.
And I would just say I'm personally grateful in that we kind of got this perfect storm. We happen to be. I got to work with some of the best people I've ever worked with in my life. We obviously worked our asses off. Got very little sleep. We didn't take ourselves too seriously, as you can tell, and still shocked that Bruce and and Peter haven't gone on to Hollywood careers after some of those videos. But but I think that we ended up kind of capturing this lightning in a bottle for a short period of time. And I think Steve has once said, the interesting thing about the computer industry is that the stuff you do gets obsoleted over time. You're just basically layering another brick in the wall. And so we're just kind of glad we got to contribute our brick.
Can you go back to that team photo you had up? Be nice to, yeah, there you go, thank you. See if I can actually remember some of these people. But so on the right, Ken Doyle was the person who did the HyperCard interface for QuickTime. He was on the, on loan to the core team there. And then Lee Migdal with the device there that is hard to recognize, did the early compression of Road Pizza for the QuickTime team, as well as a lot of other things. And Mark Kruger was instrumental in all the the codec manager, all the compression schemes, JPEG, MPEG, everything to do with video and acceleration. And then Sean Callahan, next to me there, did the animation compressor and a lot of the graphics routines.
And the graphics compressor,
and the
with his initials.
And the graphics compressor with the file, with the format, Sean M. Callahan, I believe. Then myself, then Peter Hottie, then Jim Batson, then Gary Woodcock, who also worked on HyperCard stuff.
No, a lot of video capture.
And
Gary was
in the input manager
and stuff like that.
And I guess we've got, Eric Hoffert there?
And that's Chris Thorman, who did the first version of the standard file preview work.
Okay, and then George Cossey?
Yep.
Who did the CD-ROM optimization and a lot of the utility tools and other things. And as I said, there's plenty of other people that worked on QuickTime and on the QuickTime team. This is one of the shots of the core group over there at Dianza 3.
So this is a good time to move on to the audience questions. So where did the name QuickTime come from?
There's a lot of debate about that. We think that, Apple had this history of quick draw for graphics. So quick media, quick time, there was something that made sense to keep that parallel. Recently, we've seen this Don Casey video where supposedly QuickTime was trademarked a year before we had seen the video. And so maybe we got it from there subconsciously, or don't know.
I think Don Casey definitely gets the credit. I don't know who gave it to him. But he definitely presented it at the 1990 Worldwide Developers Conference and did a great job of presenting something that I wonder who told him about.
Were there any women or minorities on the QuickTime team?
For Apple at the time, the majority of the women were in user interface, right? And so there was, I've lost her name. Joy Montfort did some really early, really interesting work on user interface.
Yeah, Rachel Cohen on the evangelism team. We definitely had people on the team, but I think it still obviously is a challenge for Silicon Valley in general, and I think something that was even more exacerbated at the time.
Yeah, I'm definitely on the ATG team, on the pencil test team, Galen Sussman and Nancy Tagg.
So I think we actually touched on this earlier, but how did you get management support to change the distribution paradigm for QuickTime?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, getting the extension out there was really just following the footsteps of 32-bit QuickDraw and kind of just that cheating path that we'd created to support hardware developers. On the consumer model, I mean, that was really Doug's brainchild of, how do we raise awareness and how do we get something useful to customers versus just developers, right? To create the marketplace on both sides.
I think it's also important on Bruce's side, we wanted to be part of the mainstream release. So we first went to the System 7 team, and it was patted us on the head, basically, and said, we'll get to you after we get System 7 out the door. So wait in line, and System 7 won. And that's when kind of the extension strategy just made a lot of sense.
Actually, I meant to ask about that earlier, but how were you sort of impacted by the System 7 release schedule? How did that affect your development? really scared you?
Well, I'll start that because it's what got me my job on the QuickTime team. System 7, which was codenamed Big Bang, which is as appropriate a name as something could have, was massive. I mean, it consumed all the resources that Apple had for a long time and then some. And there was a spot on the QuickTime team for, I think it was Charlton Louis, who was working on TrueType stuff and other stuff. And he couldn't join the team because he was pinned down with System 7 stuff. And so there was this empty office right next to Bruce and plenty of engineering work to do. And so eventually I sort of ended up filling that spot. But there was a lot of other things that Bruce and Doug can talk about.
I mean, somehow we ended up in this space separate from the mothership where System 7 was happening. And so we were definitely living in our own world and on our own schedule, on our own train, and had plenty of work to do and very little distraction. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, we're old and gray and our minds are failing us, so if we're missing any facts here that folks in the audience know of how we got there, what we did, let us know. But yeah, I mean, it was really kind of this rebel team off on the side.
I mean, it was literally, you read books about how to manage projects, kind of skunkworks projects, and those didn't exist at the time.
Yeah.
But these guys really set it up right. We were in another building across the street from where System Software was. And that street was like a 8-lane superhighway, so you didn't cross it lightly. And the other people in the building were all like networking people and other stuff, which were not normal acquaintances of ours. And so we were just isolated from our friends in this other building, where we could see the building where the other work was going on. And it gave us an incredible amount of focus and just kind of kept us off the radar and kept us from getting pulled into meetings. And I think it was really important.
We never had meetings.
What surprises you most about the tools an average consumer today has to work with video?
Wow. I think, how much of this stuff is so democratized. My kids just play with this stuff like it was, natural to them. They pick up an iPad when they were 3 or, an iPhone later and are used to editing stuff and moving stuff around. And just kind of second nature. And I think part of that is, how smooth it all is, all the interface pieces. But to me, it really, the surprising part is that what we set out to do of saying, how does this become just a common data type, just taken for granted, and that's kind of satisfying to see.
I think that one surprising thing is how much mainstream content, is now consumed on what we think of as computer devices, right? Whether it's an iPad, whether it's an Apple TV, and you don't think twice about it. Right? Digital video is normal. Analog video is weird. That whole interlaced thing, and that just doesn't exist anymore. Where it was completely different. Right? Digital video was a little corner playground, and not for mainstream consumption of anything in our day. And today, traditional television may go away.
So here's another question that I wasn't able to ask during the previous part. You mentioned both HyperCard and CD-ROM. So how important were these other technologies to the success of QuickTime and to multimedia as a whole?
Really important. If you think about HyperCard, the whole notion of hyperlinking, and obviously, Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web, the whole concept that you were jumping around and kind of following an exploration path was incredibly important for authoring this piece rather than just having a video that was playing in a window. So you see things like News Navigator where you could kind of bring these elements together was super, super interesting. One of the things that we were talking about earlier that actually is interesting if you kind of blend those two together that still I don't think has really seen its full potential is the notion of interactivity embedded within video itself. That's one of the things that we talked about way back when that I think still has a lot of promising future.
Yeah, CD-ROM was critical. We had no way to distribute video. A dial-up modem wasn't gonna work. You weren't gonna buy a hard disk, and so for the first few years, it was all about how do we make content work well on CD-ROMs. Fortunately, they got a little bit faster, which helped. We got a little bit smarter, which also helped. And so we got to the point where we could deliver pretty good stuff, and there was, a thriving CD-ROM business. Hundreds, maybe thousands of titles a year that were coming out, educational, entertainment, games, all kinds of stuff to do that. And it was all possible because of the CD-ROM, and the front end to a lot of those was HyperCard. So one of the companies that made Laserdiscs was Voyager, and they started transitioning to CD-ROMs. And a guy named Colin Holgate did some brilliant work to put the Beatles' Hard Day's Night onto a CD-ROM. And he only found like 1 million bugs. Like Bruce mentioned, synchronization is hard. Like an hour-and-a-half video, good luck, from where we started. But they didn't just put it on there. They put all this background information that was a HyperCard stack that you could navigate through. You could watch as the video was playing, or you could navigate through. So they had the whole script. You could search the script, click on a line, and it would immediately take you and play that part. It's not a big deal today, but at the time, it was like crazy. And they had the whole script. And that all just barely fit on one CD-ROM. And those sorts of things ended up, in fact, influencing the DVD spec. So DVD didn't exist then at all. And DVD has all this crazy interactivity. And what they were trying to do was actually copy what was being done with things like HyperCard and Director using QuickTime off of CD-ROMs. And that went even more out of control on Blu-ray. It's spectacular. But the need for interactivity with video, like around the video or in the video, is very basic. And what's really happened, HyperCard linking was often seen as a precursor to the web. You mentioned Tim Berners-Lee. A lot of that interactivity has, in fact, become the website, right? Yeah. YouTube has the ability to search the content of a video. And so HTML is, in fact, picking up a lot of that role, but still a scripting language, like HyperTalk was a scripting language, and now it's JavaScript.
Yeah.
Even just as simple as you've got 2,000 developers, I don't know how many we had at the developers conference, how do you get them this extension? You could give them the extension on a floppy disk, but if you actually want any video, the only way you're doing it was this. We did this big flourish where suddenly I think the walls rose and had FedEx delivering CDs to people and but how do you get this collection of video to a set of folks? CD was the only way.
CD was the YouTube channel of the day.
Right. Yeah.
Just a little slower on the delivery side.
Yeah. Well, then fast forward 5 years, 10 years, then everything is now streaming. And Peter, you mentioned earlier that Apple was late to the streaming game. Could you talk a little bit more about the QuickTime streaming effort?
Yeah, it was. We were successfully heads down between CD-ROM and professional authoring for the core QuickTime team, and successfully, like Final Cut sort of exists in part because of some of that work. Randy gets all the credit at the end of the day for Final Cut being awesome, but we worked very closely with that team, and that helped bring it into Apple. But that was 2 big projects, and we were fighting Microsoft on that, which was a pretty formidable opponent. We would go to meetings with Microsoft, and they would say, we figured out how to keep growing the team forever. 500 is the critical mass size at Microsoft for a team. And once you hit it, you can't grow anymore. So once we get there, we just divide in 2 and keep going. And this was how they grew their multimedia effort. And we were like, yeah, we're about to go out of business. We're very happy to have a few people working on QuickTime. And but the conferencing people, Eric Hoffert was playing with this, working on some of the codecs that were necessary for that, looking at some of the protocols. So we had people who were playing there. We were just sort of late to like 6 months, a year, to really decide that we needed to focus on that. But when we did, it was a natural fit. We very quickly had a plugin for Netscape, which was the browser at the time. We had the QuickTime plugin, and that was really easy. The good folks who were defining the internet at the W3C reserved us a MIME type, video/QuickTime, without us ever asking, because we were kind of so common as a file format. And that I always thought that was a big deal, because if you look at MIME types, which is how web browsers identify content, it's usually video/x-something, where X means it's not official. There's only a few that don't have an X, and QuickTime is always video/QuickTime, because somebody defined it. So we got in there, we did a lot of work, and what really, we sort of missed the boat on basic, kind of streaming of content, but we really got into live. And we had this one thing that was super spectacular kind of at the end of my time at Apple to help that, which was Steve Jobs' keynotes. And so live streaming of those sort of started to become a thing, which is terrible because lots of people wanted to see them and it stressed it out, and we built an alliance with Akamai to get bandwidth. But I mean, eventually Apple did a really credible job, and clearly, Apple TV streams a little bit of content these days. So, congratulations to the folks who carried that forward. But yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? It's the classic kind of incumbent's curse. You're busy working on the things that are important to you. Everybody called QuickTime Video postage stamp video, right? And we worked for years to get the video bigger, so we could not have that stigma anymore. And streaming came along, and what was it? It was video that was even smaller than QuickTime 1.0 that looked even worse. And everybody was excited about this, and we couldn't go back to that. Like there was some hesitation to do it. So.
Too many scars.
Yeah.
So, my final question is, how has your experience on QuickTime informed your subsequent work and career?
Okay, I can go. I mean, once in multimedia, always in multimedia, I think, whatever that means. But post-Apple, I went to a company called General Magic to join some of the original Macintosh team working on, Bill Atkinson, one of the founders of HyperCard, and Andy Hertzfeldt, and some of the great minds in the industry working on the idea of creating a multimedia device that was wireless, that could be a personal communicator, that could have hyperlinking, that would go beyond what had, and actually have compute in the cloud. So you can actually have an application store where you can have, just imagine delivering applications to a wireless personal communicator and having a cloud compute infrastructure that could make that possible. And so that was, trying to take the interactivity and put it around the experience. A little early for its time. Post that, I actually went to Peter Barrett's company called Rocket Science Games, where we did literally interactive video off CD-ROMs for games machines, which was a straight line from QuickTime. And then the next stop was a company called WebTV, where we actually did almost the opposite, right? Instead of trying to bring television into the computer, bring the computer into the television.
Yeah, I think for me, I left Apple to go join a startup called Starlight Networks that was trying to do video networking because the networking side wasn't quite there at Apple yet. And then the first startup that the company I started on my own was called MyPlay, and we were basically had the notion of a digital locker in the cloud where you could stream initially music, but ultimately the vision was games and video as well. So obviously influenced from the QuickTime days. I think also just the notion of really understanding what a high-performing team looked like, I think has really served me well. The importance of having those key players in place. How do you get an environment that's productive? Maybe not working quite as hard as we did for that year, in terms of balancing out over multiple years. But how do you really kind of get that energy and that team together has always been something I've been trying to replicate.
The team and the way that Bruce managed it was, had a massive impact. Some of the people that I worked with at the time, I still work with, which is spectacular and strange. But Bruce didn't manage. He just walked around and talked to people and made other people talk to each other, which was very effective, and had something that I keep doing to this day in terms of performance of software, which is basically, there's a whole, if you talk to people, they talk about architecture. It's like the big thing. I'm the architect of this, the architecture is really important. And I remember these conversations where Bruce's approach was just make it work. Make it fast, show it can be done, and then we can figure out how to get the architecture to support that. And there's a lot of things I've seen since where people are like, I'm gonna make a beautiful architecture, and if it's not fast enough, then we'll wait for the computers to get faster. And we were very much about what can we do on these devices now, and let's focus on that. After Apple, I did streaming video company, in fact. And then I did video on PDAs, which was fun. And then I decided I didn't want to do that kind of thing for a while. And so I have been doing something that still, I think, is very connected to QuickTime, which is work on making IoT devices programmable by anybody, by end users, by application providers, as opposed to being closed black boxes. And we're doing that with JavaScript because it's a nice standard for that. But the fundamental idea I realized, after doing this for a year, was exactly what it was with QuickTime, which is we want developers to be able to take control of this device, to express their ideas, where developer doesn't mean person in big company somewhere, but developer can also mean, kid sitting at home. And that kind of freedom democratization is very much part of, Apple's gestalt, but was just ran rampant through what we did in QuickTime.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, Bruce, and Doug. Everyone, please give them a round of applause. And before we close, the videos we showed in the program are all part of the Apple archives at Stanford University. They were brought to you courtesy of Apple and Stanford University libraries. Thank you.